embrace the values of the nation, we must do more than just issue white papers. Values are understood when they can be witnessed in the actions of people.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you happen to be joining us from. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, coming to you here live from the Dean's Conference Room on our Malibu, California campus. For our friends back east, I am going to refrain from telling you what the temperature is here in Malibu, but I can assure you it is quite balmy as we enter into Black History Month, and couldn't be more honored or delighted than to be joined by Bob Woodson for today's conversation, Black History, an Affirmation of American Values. This session, like so many of ours, is meant to be interactive, and so wanted to let you know that we are going to first begin the format with a conversation. Bob's going to set the table with some comments, and then we're going to get involved into a conversation. Your questions are welcomed via the chat feature that you'll no doubt find at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we've got an hour together here to learn from a legendary civil rights activist and one who continues to engage in public policy and political issues. You all know Bob's work, but I will give a little bit more of his detailed background. Bob is the founder and president emeritus of the Woodson Center. He is what I would call a civic entrepreneur who is always finding new ways through civil society to engage in policy issues and debates. He's also the founder of 1776 Unites and the Voices of Black Mothers United. As you know, he's a national speaker on policy issues on issues related to poverty alleviation, as well as empowering disadvantaged communities. This is not something he just writes about, but it's something that he does. His example as not only a thinker, but a doer of public policy is one that we salute here at the Graduate School of Public Policy. Not only is he engaged in the communities in which he works directly, but through the Woodson Center, there are affiliates around the country. On the issue specifically of civil rights, his social activism dates back to the 1960s, where he developed and coordinated national and local community revitalization programs. During the 1970s, he directed the National Urban League's Administration of Justice Division. He served as a resident fellow for the American Enterprise Institute from 74 to 81, leaving the Institute to launch what would become the Woodson Center. He is a prolific writer on a variety of issues and serves as a contributing editor to The Hill, Washington Examiner, and Wall Street Journal, published essays in newspapers throughout the country, and as well as journal articles. He's also written several books on issues of race, American history, and poverty alleviation. He's the recipient of the prestigious John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Genius Fellowship Award, as well as the Bradley Prize, Presidential Citizens Medal, the 2018 William Wilberforce Award, the Heritage Foundation's 2020 Salvatore Prize for American Citizenship, and many other honors. Before we welcome in Bob, it is worth noting his longstanding affiliation here with the School of Public Policy. And as last month kicked off the School of Public Policy's 25th anniversary year, it's worth noting that Bob was our first speaker back in 1997, essentially helping us open our doors through an event in the fall of 1997 at the Miramar Hotel in Santa Monica. And I wanted to there's a great album of photographs. I could have selected a dozen of them, but this is just one from that event on October 7th, 1997. Our first class of students was present, as well as several hundred other supporters of this fledgling graduate school. He is pictured here with Dean Wilburn, our founding dean, Jim Wilburn, there on the left, and then president of Pepperdine University, David Davenport. And while he has spoken here on a number of occasions, as we celebrate this auspicious 25th anniversary, it is just an honor and timely that we welcome back Bob Woodson, albeit virtually, to the Pepperdine School of Public Policy. So Bob, great to have you back.
It's great. It's good to see that picture of my friend Jim Wilburn. I remember Jim's gone into community with me, and we had a treasured neighborhood leader, Leon Watkins, who's deceased, but I have fond memories. I've seen Jim from time to time, so it was just a delight to become reacquainted.
Well, great to have you back, Bob. Again, the title of this talk and conversation is Black History, an Affirmation of American Values. And maybe we can start there with how you see that connection.
Well, just for a little background, I grew up in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in a blue-collar Black neighborhood during the time of segregation. I was born during the Depression. And 95% of the households on my little street had a man and a woman raising children. Never heard a gun fired from the time I was in K through 11th grade. Never heard of an elderly person being mugged on my street. Never heard of a child being shot in their crib. So although we were growing in segregation, we were buttressed by a set of Judeo-Christian values. But my dad died when I was 9, and a mother with a 5th grade education had to raise 5 children. And my friends were a year older than me. And when you're in a situation like that, your peer group becomes a surrogate family. So I understand why kids join gangs. So it isn't the organization that we oppose, it's the criminal actions of a gang. So I grew up with an appreciation of that. Long story short, I dropped out of high school at 11th grade because my friends were a year older, which meant that I would have to grow up in my neighborhood unaffiliated, and you don't do that. So I went in the military in 1954 and was blessed to finish my high school education there. Went into the space program, flying missile test control at Canaveral. And at a time I had 12 credits from University of Miami at a time when I could not go on the campus because of segregation. So the military had extension courses on the base. And so after I was discharged and went to Cheney University, I worked in a juvenile jail, locked behind 3 doors of juveniles committed there for gang murder and truancy. They were treated the same with no programs, locked behind 3 doors. It was there that I had kind of a burning bush experience before I knew what a burning bush was. But I fell in love with these kids because they very much reflected the kind of background that I had. And if there were 5 of them, I would have adopted if I had the money, the resources to do so. But it set I was getting a degree in math and science, and I did. But then I realized that I had to set on another course, and that was to provide service to these kind of kids, to be a surrogate to them. And so I graduated, went to the University of Penn School of Social Work, because I believe that it's important for love. It's not enough to love someone. The love has to be administered in a way that has discipline with it in order for it to be helpful to people. So I became a young civil rights activist in the 60s in Westchester, Pennsylvania. That's the town of Barrett Rustin, aide to Dr. King. And so I met Dr. King and Barrett Rustin. They would come in town and draw the press, and then we would air local issues. But I became disenchanted with the civil rights movement on the issue of forced busing for integration. I believed that that was a fundamental strategic mistake to argue separate is inherently unequal. That's a very important distinction. And so I thought that the opposite of segregation was desegregation, not integration. And so this set me at odds with the traditional civil rights leadership. The second issue that concerned me was that when we led demonstrations outside of a pharmaceutical company, when they desegregated, they'd hired 9 Black PhD chemists. When we asked them to join the movement, they said they got these jobs because they were qualified, not because of the sacrifices of people who were janitors, hairdressers, and just factory workers. And that happened several times. And I realized that many of the people who suffered and sacrificed most did not benefit from the change. And so when the doors of opposition, so I left the civil rights movement under the issue of those 2 issues to work on behalf of to seek upward mobility for all people, regardless of their race. Dr. King said, what good does it do to have the right to live in a neighborhood of your choosing if you don't have the means to exercise that right? So I realized that in order for freedom to be fully realized, people have to be prepared to live free. And so I began to work on behalf of low-income people. But I got my first national job with the Unitarian Service Committee. And I realized that with this liberal religious group, it enabled me to fly around the country and meet grassroots groups. I helped the Indians take over Alcatraz. I worked with Cesar Chavez. But what I also found that this liberal religious organizations, all the money they raised, 70 cents of every dollar did not go to the people they were serving. It went to the administration and fundraising. And so I fell out of favor and went to the Urban League thinking I'd go to a Black liberal organization. They would be better. They were worse. And then I met my first conservative, Dr. Peter Berger and his wife, Brigitte. And so I was working at the Urban League, disappointed that the same exploitation of the poor exists there. And then I met Peter and James Q. Wilson and some of the others. Peter was having some seminars when he was exploring to empower people, mediating structures.
Great book. Great
Peter
book.
invited 4 activists from the Urban League to join with these scholars. I'd never met a conservative before. And so for 3 days, I had these debates as an activist with James Q. Wilson and others, Vanden Haag, Walter Miller and all. And this is important because Jim Miller was arguing as an economist, if you increase the cost of crime, then crime will go diminish because people will weigh the consequences. And that became the dominant policy prescription of the day. Well, I challenged that. I said, the people that I know, these young gang members, threatening them with sanctions is like threatening a kamikaze pilot with death. Death is what they do. It is a cultural, it is not an economic issue. And just merely manipulating the environment with incentives and sanctions is insufficient to produce the kind of change in behavior that you're seeking. Well, I left forgetting about it. And 3 months later, Peter Berger called me, reintroduced him. So I had no idea he was this world-renowned sociologist. And so I had little appreciation for policy. I just thought that people did that when they had nothing better to do. But Peter helped me realize that winners and losers are always judged by the rules of the game. And policy, not the race or sex of the ruler, it's the rules of the game. And so he helped me to appreciate that. And so he said, I want you as a practitioner to come to the American Enterprise Institute and write a book based upon your perspective on this policy. And I said, I don't understand. So we developed a relationship. So I went to the American Enterprise Institute as a practitioner And because what I wanted to do is that a lot of conservative and policies that I had been reviewing now, they were the ones who were dictating the actions of people and low-income people without any involvement. Because, and it was at the American Enterprise Institute that I was able to go back to a lot of the groups that I had served and study how they were able to generate change from within those communities. So there was an appreciation from what mediating structures. And so I began to, and the model that I followed was from Genesis of the book of Joseph. I mean, the story of Joseph in Genesis was the foundation of my work at the American Enterprise Institute. Joseph, as you know, was from a dysfunctional Hebrew family of 12, and he was sold into slavery, and you know the story.
Right.
But Joseph, what was unique about Joseph, even though he was treated unjustly, he never succumbed to bitterness, nor did he lose his faith. And through all the trials and tribulations, he remained faithful to his God. And when Pharaoh, if it wasn't for the good Pharaoh, we wouldn't know about Joseph. A good Pharaoh is someone who's a powerful person who's able to dream bad dreams in good times, but also able to reach across race and ethnic lines and empower a 31-year-old uneducated Hebrew shepherd. And so that became the model that I have for the center, because my grassroots leaders that I have been blessed to serve over the years are social entrepreneurs. These are people who are the Josephs. There are two types of Joseph. There are Josephs of Genesis who were blameless, but in a circumstances where they were treated unjustly, but they never succumbed to bitterness. And eventually were the architect of programs and policies that saved not only the family members who betrayed him, but also the Egyptians who enslaved them. And so this is the understanding that I took at the Woodson Center, and how I approach neighborhood development to go into those communities and identify healing agents. We believe that the principles also of the social in the market economy should apply to the social economy. Only 3% of the people who are entrepreneurs generate 70% of the jobs. And they tend to be C students, according to David Birch's study. A students come back to Pepperdine and teach, C students endow. But smart people have to have all the answers before they act. And when they act, the opportunity's gone. But you see, C students are able to act in the presence of their doubts and uncertainty. And so this is the understanding that I was able to take. And when I look back at how and why we're in this mess we're in today, where the whole issue of race and gladiatorial combat substitutes for debate, and America is being denigrated by the left. And the argument that they make is that the problems facing low-income Blacks today, with a high out-of-wedlock birth, the violence, the lack of economic development, are legacies of slavery and Jim Crow. And this is what the proposition of 1619 project by the New York Times, that America is incurably racist and that all white people are privileged, and therefore they should pay reparations and all Blacks are victims. Well, since I believe that the radical left is using the rich legacy of the civil rights movement to denigrate the fundamental founding values of the country. And unfortunately, corporations and all have brought into this fantasy. And a friend of mine, Delano Spears, defined that this narrative that we're confronting now, that I want to just talk about, is being driven by guilty whites who are seeking absolution from crimes they never committed, and entitled rich Blacks was seeking absolutions from injustices they never suffered. These are the people who are driving this race narrative and that is tearing this country apart, assuming that the fundamental values are therefore racist and therefore America must be changed and turned around. Some of the people who are advocating these Marxist practices are driven by ill intentions, but there are many more who are merely uninformed, ill-informed. And so we think it's important at the Woodson Center. So that's why, since the messengers are Black, pushing this false narrative, we felt that the messenger to push against this should also be Black-led. So we've assembled 25 scholars and activists to come together, and we didn't want to offer an alternative debate. We wanted to offer an alternative narrative that was inspirational and aspirational. And the problems that conservatives face in confronting this position is that they're taking ideological weapons to a narrative fight.
That's powerful.
It is important. That's why we have more than just conservatives. Clarence Page is one of our authors because he's a liberal journalist. But we also, if we are to recruit people to embrace the values of the nation, we must do more than just issue white papers, offer free downloads on the Constitution. Values are understood when they can be witnessed in the actions of people, so they can be demonstrated. So what we did in our essays is that we attacked the fundamental proposition that racism and a history of slavery is responsible, the legacy for the problems facing Blacks today. This is patently not true. And so in our essays, for instance, we looked at the records of 6 major plantations to look at what was the state of the Black family after slavery. 75% of Black families in slavery had a man and a woman raising children. The nuclear family continued for 100 years. So we document that when whites were at their worst, Blacks were at their best. American Blacks could never be justified by oppression and slavery, as the media like to do. And so what we did is document in our essays this fact. Another example, in between 1930s and 1940, during the Depression, that the marriage rate among Blacks was higher than any other group in the nation. Elderly people could walk safely in their community without fear of being assaulted by their grandchildren. We closed the education gap in the South between 1920 and 1940 because Julius Rosenwald, the Jewish CEO of Sears, partnered with Booker T. Washington to build 5,000 schools for illiterate Blacks. Julius Rosenwald put up $4 million. The Black community raised $4.7 million in the construction of these schools. And a recent study found that the education gap between whites and Blacks was 3 years, 8th grade for whites, 5th grade for Blacks. And in just 20 years, that gap closed within 6 months. So when Blacks were denied access to hotels, we built our own. The Wallahaji in Atlanta, the Carver and Calvert hotels in Miami, the St. Teresa in Chicago, in New York, and the St. Charles in Chicago. In Chicago. When we were denied access to capital, we went to the burial societies in our churches. In places like Bronzeville section of Chicago in 1929, there were 731 Black-owned businesses Blacks had $100 million in real estate assets. Every city had its own Black Wall Street. The Greenwood section of Tulsa, Hayti section of Durham, North Carolina. Some of you participating in this seminar should go on YouTube and type in Negro Durham. We found a 16mm tape of what happened during the Black Wall Street of Durham, North Carolina. In 1940, the median income of Blacks in Durham were comparable to what the white median incomes nationally. There are all kinds of examples of Blacks who have achieved against the odds under the most difficult circumstances. And this is a part of American history, but all of those gains that we made, building hotels, businesses, the out of wedlock birth was less than 10% in 1929. And as Tom Sowell pointed out, the poverty rate in the Black community was on a steady decline between 1940 and 1960, from 86% down to about 30%, and it was going down further. But all of these gains that we made, building hospitals, 100 colleges and universities and medical schools, all of these gains came to a halt in the 1960s. So the problems that we are confronting today are a direct result of government intervention in the marketplace that converted $22 trillion on programs to aid the poor. We created a commodity out of poor people because 70 cents of those dollars administered by Black elected officials in all of these cities. We created a commodity out of poor people where we asked not which problems are solvable, but which ones are fundable. And so that's when you saw the decline in the nuclear family occurred between 1965 and today. It went from 85% of two-parent households down to 30%. What slavery and decades of Jim Crow could not destroy, government intervention since the 60s did.
Now, Bob,
let me just stop there. And
yeah, you've really put a lot on the table, and where I'd like to go from here for the rest of our time. And again, I welcome questions from our audience here. You can type those into the chat feature. I can say that there was a private note sent to me that I'll make public that indeed Dean Emeritus Jim Wilburn is on the line and sends along his best regards to you, regarding you really as one of our founding fathers here at the Policy School. Your example in understanding the role of government as well as the role of civil society is certainly part of the DNA here at the Graduate Policy School, and wanted to make sure that was noted. So what I'd like to go from here is down two different tracks. At one, we are a graduate policy school, and much of what you've discussed, researched, done is at the intersection of civil society and government. And so I want to explore that. But I want to get to the issues of race that you also raise, and especially the American experience. Again, the title of this is that that the Black experience is an affirmation of American values. And so I wanted to read back to you from a piece that you wrote just a couple months ago and get your reflections on this, because it struck me, something that you just said there about Black history. You wrote in this piece, and I quote, "I believe from the bottom of my heart that America belongs to Black Americans as much as it belongs to anyone else. Yes, many of us have suffered immensely, but the fiery trial of those sufferings has brought forth a kind of resilience," a word that you've used several times here, "and what I like to call, quote, radical grace. which has the power to show our entire nation the way forward. Therein lies the real moral authority of Black America today. Bob, those are tear-jerking words as I read them. I want you to speak to this balance that you somehow seem to strike between an understanding of the sufferings with this resilience and radical grace, in which, as you propose here, that Black Americans have a unique moral authority. So first, I'd like to talk about this radical grace and unique moral authority, and then how that can be appropriately communicated.
Okay. We saw examples in the Bible with Joseph and radical grace, where even though those who brought false witness against him, even his family members, he never became bitter towards them. He still was faithful to his God, even in the presence. Dr. King was an example of radical grace in action. And he was the one who said we must practice agape love. Agape love does not seek to destroy the opposition. It seeks to redeem the opposition, while at the same time protecting yourselves from the oppression. And Dr. King gave an example of that when his house was firebombed. His wife and small daughter barely got out in time. And he was standing there with 200 Blacks who were well armed, ready to tear the city apart. Even in the presence of his weeping wife, watching the house burn, Dr. King preached peace. He said, no, we must not pursue that. We must do that. Another example of Robert Small, the man who was born in Sumter, South Carolina, and was a slave on a southern supply ship. And one night when his masters went to have dinner, he and 6 of his crewmen took the ship, put on the master's hat and coat, and picked up this families of their slave crew and maneuvered past 5 southern garrisons and turned the ship over to the Union Navy. He was celebrated throughout, and it was the cause Lincoln to allow Blacks to fight in the Civil War. Afterwards, he became a first Black commissioned officer in the Navy. He became a wealthy businessman and a member of Congress during Reconstruction. Robert Smalls went back and purchased a plantation on which he was a slave. And because the wife and children of the slave master had become destitute, he took them in and allowed her to sleep in her same bedroom because she was delusional and didn't know slavery had ended. That to me is an act of radical grace. And there are other examples of radical grace that I can cite. But King prevented this country from really descending into a race war. Because he says, as a minority in a majority country, our only salvation is to compel this nation to live up to its ideals, that America should never be defined by its birth defect of slavery. None of us should want to be judged by the worst of what we used to be.
On that, Bob, that triggers a thought in another piece that you wrote for The Hill magazine a couple of years ago, leading up to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. You noted from his I Have a Dream speech, and I'm just going to quote here from the piece you wrote, as he noted in his I Have a Dream speech, the founding American principles were a promissory note. That term promissory note is directly in that speech, to be cashed by all who lived here, not a rejection slip. Now, that phrase promissory note and King's use of it to me is really one of the genius turns of phrases in American political rhetoric. But what it does ipso facto, as any promissory note does, is that a promissory note, to be seen as genuine, trusts the writer of that note. You know, if you get a promissory note from somebody you don't trust, it's worthless. You're not being paid immediately for whatever the service is. But I want you to explore a little bit, as you do, and certainly through your project 1776 Unites, this understanding of the founding and how King used an understanding of the American founding to call people to a higher purpose and an affirmation of the founding, even as it was not realized at the time of the founding.
Yes, someone once said that the left says, well, because many of the signers of the Declaration were slaveholders, and therefore their actions was a contradiction to what they wrote. And I believe that's why it didn't come from them. Because why would someone write a document that hold their own behavior as suspect? I believe it was divinely inspired. And that's why it was. And as John Adams wrote, that capitalism and democracy are but empty vessels into which we pour our Judeo-Christian values as a nation. That those instruments in themselves mean nothing without the values, like you say. If you enter a contract with someone, a contract is only an agreement between two honest people.
Yeah.
It just sets the terms of the relationship, our obligation to one another. But if it's signed by someone who is dishonest, it is no protection to you. And so part of the American experiment is those fundamental values, Judeo-Christian values that unites us. Every war that this country fought in the protection of those virtues and values, a Black person participated. Not one was ever found guilty of treason. So, and so it's because of the promise and the ideals that are contained in that. But again, that's what is uniquely American. That these are empty values, empty vessels into which we pour our values as a nation. It is not for people without those values.
Well, I want to press that point, Bob. As many of our listeners and viewers on the screen know, the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine is one of 200 graduate policy programs in the United States, but we are one of only 5 that are based at a Christian university. And so this discussion around faith and politics, faith and moral leadership are topics that we take deeply seriously here. And to conflate the answers to these last 2 questions, both in an understanding of what you call radical grace, but also in an understanding of this divinely inspired founding. Can there be a way forward, to quote back to this piece I mentioned before? Can there be a way forward? Can there be an understanding and a promulgation of radical grace? Can there be this understanding of what you call a real moral authority without it being grounded in faith?
No.
Or is that an essential, maybe lubricant, if you will, to realizing this?
You know, I'm on my own journey. When I started the center, it was really to pursue social justice for poor people. And so I wanted to deepen my understanding of how people have been transformed that I've met. I didn't understand how, but I know they were. So for 2 years, I went around the country and we had town meetings in 7 different locations where we brought grassroots people in from 100 miles. And we asked them questions that poor people never get asked. What works and why does it work in your life? Just a typical example, first session I had in Hartford, Connecticut, these 4 well-dressed people, a Hispanic woman in a dark business suit, other guys who came up, and I said, you know, I don't want to hear from the social workers or the counselors. I want to hear from the people. So I was a little disappointed when they sat down. But the first thing the young lady, she said, I used to be a prostitute and a drug addict. Psychiatrists couldn't change me. Jail didn't change me. But until I met Pastor Raul and I met the person of Jesus Christ, have I been transformed. And now I have my children back and I'm in school. I heard these kind of testimonies time and time again. And some of my friends warned me about what was going to happen. But we saw all over the country, some people wept when they could acknowledge publicly that faith changed them, Christ changed them.
Mm.
And so I was just overwhelmed, and it changed. I had staff quit. They said, are we becoming a church? I had a funder. What I did was I chronicled everything they said. I selected 150 of the most powerful testimonies so I could write it up. And I shared it with a group of about 150 grassroots leaders, and I invited them all to come to Washington for a 4-day conference to make sure what I had written about them reflected what they actually did. I wanted them to validate it. So we weren't making a mistake. Well, a funder who promised, he said, well, they can't talk about Christ. I said, I'm not taking a position. So the guy withdrew the funds.
Wow.
So since American Express doesn't collect for 30 days, being the good steward that I was at the time.
And remain.
But the long story short, it transformed my understanding of all this, because 90% of the stories that were told of redemption and transformation was all Christ-centered.
Mm.
And so I began to understand that everything that I do, everything that I write reflects the testimony and experiences of those that I serve.
Mm.
And so and this is with a tension between conservative scholars and the Woodson Center, because those scholars do not spend very much time talking to untutored people about their experiences, nor is there much of a respect from either the left or right of untutored people. The assumption is that poverty makes you not only dispirited, but stupid and unwise. And so James C. Scott, in his book, Seeing Like a State,
Great
two
book.
types of episteme knowledge and metis knowledge.
That's right.
Conservatives are great with episteme knowledge and have no respect for metis knowledge.
Yes.
That you can maneuver a ship, teach someone in a classroom how to maneuver a ship across an ocean. But when that ocean liner gets to the port of Baltimore, you need a a harbor master. Well, my grassroots Josephs were harbor masters. And what we must do is respect their common sense experience and let their common sense experience be reflected in the policies that we pursue. When I look at my colleagues over the last 40 years on poverty, all I get is a recitation of the pathology of the poor. I don't see very many scholars going into neighborhoods where there are islands of excellence, moral and spiritual rejuvenation, communities being transformed. No one goes in to study the success or the resilience of people. That's my soapbox.
Well, it's a powerful soapbox, Bob. We've got some great questions coming in here from our audience. One question from David, who notes, I saw Bob at the Abbey Resort in Lake Geneva, Wisconsin last summer. Bob's positive message is incredible. Your book, Red, White, and Black, is great. I love the mind you assembled for this work. Do you have plans to break these positive messages down into bite-sized bits for this new generation? How can a regular guy like me help your effort working at a local level?
Well, what we're going to do now and thanks for that question, is that we really need to bring the nation together. In order to do that, we've got to push the whole issue of race off the table. This racial demagoguery has to stop. But the way you do it is put a more compelling issue on the table. And so we started a group called Voices of Black Mothers United. There are thousands of mothers who lost their children to homicide. But they're also, we brought them together from some mothers from Silicon Valley and other places who've lost their children to suicide, and Appalachian mothers who lost their children to prescription drugs. So we're bringing them together, called Mothers United to Save Our Children. And we're coming together with solutions because there's a moral and spiritual freefall that we're engaged in that is causing our young people to devalue their lives to the point where they'll take their own life or take someone else's. They're different sides of the same coin. But if we have to look at each other through a racial prism, we can never explore solutions. And so we really think that that's the kind of coalition that we're going to come together, uniting and as Americans to address, like in Silicon Valley, the teen suicide rate is 6 times the national average. Those mothers' problems aren't privilege. Homicide in the inner city, their problems aren't social injustice. And so, but we're trying to get behind this. Now we have a lot of examples of our pharaohs who are funders, who are coming together, and we're having seminars. Some of them who want to do more than write checks have actually partnered with our Joseph organizations. One man turned over a 5,000 square foot building and is now working in Minden, Louisiana with our group. Some lawyers have gotten together and are representing our people. We've got some venture capitalists who are working to help our Josephs to start small businesses. So we have a lot of creative examples of when we're bringing the pharaohs and Josephs together. They're sharing their talents and skills and experience with our Josephs to rebuild communities from the inside out. So that so this is what we've got to do.
I want to go back, Bob, to a book that you referenced, because this is the second angle, and we're entering in our last 10 minutes here. I want to be mindful of everyone's time. To empower people, which you just mentioned, Seeing Like a State by Scott, who's a Yale anthropologist, a book I highly recommend. We teach it here at the School of Public Policy. But another book that we also highlight here is To Empower People, which is the edited volume by Berger and Newhouse, that highlights the work being done through civil society to address major policy issues. We take more of what I would call a communitarian approach to public policy here at SPP. One Senator Ben Sass once called us the Tocqueville School of Public Policy, and that's a name I don't mind. But I want, as a civil society leader and entrepreneur, I want you to talk a bit about the challenges that you face engaging with a public that thinks that really civil society can't get to the scale that federal government can. And then secondly, why is it important that we have a civic sector that is based in part on volunteers and philanthropy, that is still engaging with and not being crowded out of finding resolution to these major policy challenges around poverty and so forth?
Well, we could spend an hour just looking at.
We may have to have you back.
Why are you going to do that to me?
I know, it's terrible. It's terrible.
No, I'm serious. I mean, it's to unpack everything you said. It would take time, but let me just give a cursory kind of hopefully helpful response. You see, George Soros can easily just spend millions of dollars to destroy communities. It's easier, but rebuilding is troublesome. I mean, it takes. But this is where the marketplace, when you talk about scalability, grassroots leaders have demonstrated. As that piece I told you on, there's a piece on 60 Minutes. You can type in Bertha Gilkey 60 Minutes. You will see how a resident in St. Louis, with our help, over a 12-year period, took a drug-infested, rundown neighborhood and revitalized it to the point where market rate housing was built across the street. At the same time, Kimmy Gray in Washington, D.C., did the same thing with a Kenilworth Parkside, created an island, sent 600 kids to college from one public housing project, and reducing and almost eliminating teen pregnancy, and where the residents really engaged in small business development. You know, where were, so they were like the Steve Jobs of poverty. If that were a market, 80% of, 60% of Apple's income comes from a product that didn't exist 8 or 9 years ago.
Very good.
But in our market economy, once innovation occurs, and then we invest in it, and then it spreads. We never had one scholar visit Kenilworth Parkside in 12 years. We had no one come to Cochrane, Buster Soares in Somerset, New Jersey.
New Jersey, yeah.
Developed the whole area of East New Brunswick.
I know his work, yep.
Without gentrification. Where are the case studies?
Yeah.
Why aren't we rushing into those three places where there's islands of moral, spiritual, and economic revitalization without gentrification?
One would think, Bob,
the way we do our think tanks.
One would think, Bob, that there's a dean of a policy school that should be taking this very personally somewhere. I don't know. Maybe I should. No, that's amazing, Bob, that the interest of the scholarly community, whether in academia or the think tank world, is not engaging in these amazing success stories as a way of thinking about, and we do discuss this, what we would call civic innovation,
right,
that is happening around these issues.
But so who were the experts on the conservative side in poverty over the last 40 years? Charles Murray, Larry Mead, Robert Rector, and what do they write about? The failures of poor people. What do they recommend? Sanctions. Sanctions. Let's have drug testing for welfare.
Yeah.
Let's have work requirements. I'm for that. But you can't stop there. That's why conservatives have the reputation of being indifferent toward the poor and hostile to Black folks. Because we're unwilling or unable to study resilience. The Woodson Center is going to try to establish the Center for the Study of Resilience. We need institutions that spends exclusively scholars looking for examples of individual achievement against the odds and collective restoration and revitalization of communities, doing case studies, so that people are motivated to change when you show them victories that are possible and not, instead of offering them injuries to be avoided.
Bob, we didn't think about this. We didn't talk about this prior in preparation, but please count on the School of Public Policy to be an academic partner for this center. Both students and graduates here at the policy school. I want to work with you after this call to find ways to build this Center for Resilience. I think it's a brilliant concept, and one that, as you have rightly said, academia and public policy research has largely ignored the successes of civil society.
Right.
And that is so important. So definitely count on us here, and I'll look forward to following up with you on that.
Well,
I wanted to get to
students. So
I want to follow up with you. Actually, comments are coming in now, and the hour flew by. When will Dr. Woodson return? Well, as we said, I think there may be a return engagement here. Last few minutes, Bob, as we look out at a country that is deeply polarized on issues of race, from what you just said, and especially with the Mothers United organization, finding connections on issues of class and poverty is one way. The grounding of faith, which you mentioned, Buster Sories' work. I mean, that is a deep man of faith too. I know just incredible. If you were to give a next step, just say somebody is coming to you, learning about you and the work of the Woodson Center, and for the first time. This is a predominantly, as I'm looking at my Zoom screen here, predominantly a California audience, although we have people from around the world, I know, registered. What would be a next step if they have, I wouldn't be surprised, have been inspired by both your example and your call for community-based engagement, but they just don't know the next place? Would there be a resource or a group or website that we can send along here as we follow up with everybody here with a video from this conversation? What would be your recommendation?
Well, first of all, this gives me an opportunity to do a commercial. There's the second book that we have out. It's called Lessons from the Least of These. 1776 deals with policy. Lessons from the Least of These takes you into neighborhoods and identifies 10 characteristics of successful Josephs. With this book, I've had some wealthy people call me and say, Bob, I found the person that you identify in your book. And so we were introduced to some Josephs by pharaohs. And so I would advise you to look at that book and look on our website.
We'll send along those links to everybody who registers.
Yeah, because I think, first of all, let's deepen our understanding and be inspired that solutions do exist. And that low-income people that we serve are America's new patriots. And they are the ones, and so we must come together. You know, in closing, let me tell you that I was inspired by Bishop Fulton Sheen used to be one of my favorites.
Yep.
Well, there was you should go on YouTube. There's a 50-year-old sermon that he gave, and he predicted what was happening today. He said, with the moment we take God out of this country, then you're going to see the moral decline. But he said the reason that America's symbol is the eagle nests high in the mountains. And when the eaglets get to a certain age, they take their feathers out and push them out. And the eaglet falls to the earth. And just before it crashes, the mom grabs it and takes it up to the top and lets it go again until it learns to fly. He said, America, just before it crashes, God's going to lift us up until we learn to fly. And we will. I am optimistic because I know that I serve the people God has me to serve have the answers.
Yeah.
God says, the Bible says, go among the broken to be healed.
Bob, thank you so much. It's one thing for one's words to be inspirational, as yours obviously are, but your life is an inspiration. And again, as I see Dean Wilburn on this Zoom screen here, I'm just incredibly honored by the relationship and wisdom that you've given to our students over the years and your affiliation with the School of Public Policy. And I am deadly serious about wanting to continue this conversation around the Center for Resilience, and to find ways to even engage other policy schools in this work, because you are right there at the intersection of where we've been and where we're going.
Well, thank you. It was just so important to reconnect and be inspired by this forum. You ask them very fascinating questions. And like I say, some of these issues require more time, and I would love to rejoin you at some point. Maybe by then we can have some personal interaction with your students.
We'll do it.
I always enjoy that.
We'll do it.
But I always go in with the expectation I will learn something too. And so I have in this call.
Well, and we all have. So Bob, thanks so much. To all of you who joined us, thank you for making time. We are going to follow up with all those who registered with a link to this video. We ask, as we always do, that you use that as a way of promoting the work of Bob's Woodson Center, to send the video link around to friends that in your networks that may not have been able to register. We're also going to follow up with the links to the book Bob mentioned and to the Woodson Center itself. We look forward to our next online or in-person engagement. Thanks so much for joining us here at the Pepperdine School of Public Policy. God bless you and have a great rest of the day. Thanks, Bob.
All right.